Hello and welcome to Presence. I'm Doug King. Glad you joined me again for this continuing series on integral theology. Again, I know some of you are coming here from the integral theory perspective. Some of you are coming here from the theological perspective. And you're hanging in there with me as we navigate these waters because we're taking a radically new approach to an old story, to a narrative that's been around for thousands of years. So I really appreciate you joining me for this series. And today I want to go ahead and move on to Father Abraham. And last time we spoke, we dealt with the genesis of human consciousness with regard to Adam. And we saw that Adam was the opening of the eyes, the necessary opening of the eyes to the self. And rather than this being original sin, it was the way in which consciousness became aware of the very concept called sin. Adam had to have his eyes open to commandments and boundaries and who God was, who he was. That's the story, right, that we're talking about in this entire narrative, is how does that evolve? So Adam was self as source, and that's going to be a thread that continues all the way through first tier into the time of Jesus. And then the other genesis of human consciousness is going to relate to Father Abraham. Both these guys show up in Genesis, the book of Genesis. So faith is going to contrast with Adam's self as source. Faith is that which points away from the self, and that means that it will be in a direct dialectical tension with self as source. And faith is always going to be related to God as source or spirituality itself as source. In other words, for all those of us that are believers in a spiritual or divine source to our human identity and to the existence of all things, it will be on our part a matter of faith. The things that pertain to the realm of the divine or spirituality itself are not in the scientific realm. They are based on evidences, and obviously what we're doing here in this series is pointing to the evidences of this spirituality manifesting through these different levels of the spiral, and we take that evidence and we say this is why, or these are some of the reasons why I have faith in something beyond the human, that there is something that has obviously worked on a global level through history to bring us consistently to these various points with regard to spiritual consciousness. So Father Abraham is pointing away from the self, and spirituality is an upward pull, whereas the self, as started with Adam, is an inward pull. So you have these two dialectical tensions that are out there. You got Adam on the one hand with an inward pull, Abraham with following the upward pull, if you will, that evolutionary point. Out of that dialectic always comes the next level of understanding. In other words, the only reason I'd ever change my mind would be if you presented me with something that is in contrast with what I'm currently thinking, or you inform me of something that I wasn't aware of. That dialectical tension between what I'm holding to now and what is presented as a better way forward is the tension that is absolutely necessary in order for there to be growth. And that's the other point of integral theology. It's a theology that points toward human identity as always growth versus trying to reach a terminal place where you plant your flag, draw your line, and say this is truth and there is no more evolution. So in doing that, I'm going to use a chart here for Father Abraham at this stage. And as you can see, we have again our diagram of circles. This time we have 3 circles, because what we're doing now is we're incorporating the concepts that began way back before Christ with Plato that are referred to often within the field of integral theory, and that is the aspects of beauty, truth, and goodness. Now, going back to Wilber's quadrants, these are oftentimes related to truth being in the I sphere, beauty in the we sphere, and goodness in the its sphere. So beauty, truth, and goodness will correlate to I, we, its. A simpler way of saying this is truth would be head, beauty would be heart, and goodness would be hands. And the reason that that phrase is often used is because what we understand in the head, what emotionally we feel and understand with the heart, will always be manifested. And that's why we say hands, because manifestation is that right quadrant that shows how things manifest in history. So Plato was really onto something when he understood that existence really was constituted of beauty, truth, and goodness. And we want to show that what Plato originated and what many have used in integral theory is very nicely overlaid into the biblical narrative as well. So for example, in the very beginning, Adam had a truth. To him, the truth was, if I grasp this, I will be like God. That was truth to him. The beauty of it all was that this thing called a fruit, was attractive, pleasant to the eye, good to the taste. It had a beauty. He saw beauty in it. And then finally, the goodness part is the hands active part. Adam took action upon that which he saw as truth and he craved as beauty. And those two combinations led him then to his action called goodness. That's going to evolve all the way through these levels, all the way from the form through transform and into formlessness. Now, as you can see in the center of the three circles that intersect on beauty, truth, and goodness, what I did there is I've listed the self in all caps, because when you start out in consciousness, the self is in the dominant, controlling part of thinking. So the self is capitalized. Spirit is all small letters, because I wanted to show there that spirit is existing at the beginning, the archaic beginning of consciousness, but it's very much in a very, archaic state of understanding. Now, watch as we use this movement that you see here. The self and spirit are forming a double helix that go all the way up till we finally have a manifestation that shows the self in second tier, integral consciousness, is now in all small letters, and spirit is all caps. And that is the evolution of spiritual consciousness. It begins dominated by the self, but we'll see in transform what happens to the self. The self is sacrificed to the dominance of spirit. And this, of course, will involve the sacrificial work of Christ and the understanding of the body, when the body of Christ understood that they were to die with Christ. Die to what? Well, this is that thing that started in Adam. It's the thing that had been in humans all the way up until the time of Jesus, and that was that all that we are is dependent upon what we do. All that we are is dependent upon what we understand, how we obey, how we keep commandments, how we do right versus wrong, and on you go. It's always the self as source. In fact, one of the reasons that religion has a ceiling of first tier and cannot go into second tier is because religion itself is something that must be founded on self as source. Think about that for a second. Let's take Christianity, because I come from Christianity. I very much was a part in preaching, teaching, and the defending of many positions for being a Christian. Well, where did all of that come from? It came from myself. So the self is the only way that one can maintain a religious identity. In other words, if we were all in a waiting room and a baby was being born, we would not expect the nurse to rush in and say, it's a Christian. What is it then that got me to become a Christian in my identity? When I have my I am statement, for me to say I am, and then I fill in a Christian with that particular religion, what happened was something in my mind interpreted identity with regard to spirituality as Christianity religion, and I took some kind of steps that were agreed upon by some body of people that made me legitimately a Christian. And then, of course, there were many people who also would say, I am Christian. Their steps were different, their boundaries were different, and then we began the journey of denominating. And denominating, of course, is that which dominates the scene of Christianity and religion today with tens of thousands of denominations. And what is it that a denomination does? It separates. It separates one from the other. And what have we said all the way through this series is the definition of death? Separation. So rather than moving into a world where religion is trying to provide us an integral answer to spirituality, what we're saying is religion was a necessary first step, boundary-driven thinking that was necessary in this first tier form so that we could move beyond it. And what Presence is proposing is that humanity is just beginning to talk about moving beyond religion, and that we think, a millennium from now, we'll look back on all the divisiveness that exists in the world of religion and the way it attaches to a teacher or it attaches to a teaching, and therefore makes the teacher or the teaching a form to which they identify, that we will clearly move far beyond that, and people will look back on history as this being the time when that movement began. Just as we look back in history and see when many other movements began. And remember that every time a new movement begins, it's radical because it's new. And there are very few people that believe it. Why? Because it's new. And it presents a number of challenges because it's new. And so we know this about integral theology and what it's doing. One thing I would also note in our diagram here is I just put one note on this because it's an overview and I'm just trying to give a flavor, if you will, of what I'm trying to say. In the bottom part of the diagram, you see the three circles intersect, and I put in the realm of goodness, my will, because that's where the self is source. Adam was doing his will, my will. When we get to the transformative work of Jesus, you move from my will be done to thy will be done. And this is a recognition and a dependence upon Spirit as source. So those of you within your realm of faith who pray, those of you who have conversations or meditations or spiritual practices in the realm of divinity, you're doing this because you are seeking to go beyond yourself, and you are seeking to, well, you might be asking, seeking, or knocking. And so in this way, we have the evolution of spiritual consciousness as well. Now, in this faith of Abraham, because the faith itself evolves, Paul will note, now just quote Paul writing to Romans here in the first chapter, Paul makes this statement. He says, the righteousness of God is being revealed from faith to faith. Now, revealing, revelation, that's obviously a huge term in the biblical narrative. And revelation is what happens when something occurs to me that had never occurred to me before. Something's being revealed. That's part of evolution. Well, how was Paul thinking when he said the righteousness of God, which was seen as separate and something unapproachable by humans in the beginning, that the righteousness of God was being revealed later on? It would be revealed that God is going to bring all of us into a new heaven and earth wherein righteousness dwells because of God, and therefore we dwell in His righteousness as one humanity. That this is happening from faith to faith, Paul says, which means from the faith of Abraham to the faith of Christ. Paul already had a spiral dynamic view, even though there obviously wasn't anyone that was talking about spiral dynamics at that time. Paul already had a view of the way this evolutionary process worked. So let's move from Abraham, and let's move from Adam and the genesis of consciousness, and let's fast forward a bit and go into the time of Moses. Now, Moses is always going to be associated with the people of Israel. So when you're talking about the people of Israel and you're talking about Moses, you're talking about moving from this Genesis, if you will, or from the individual Adam, the individual Abraham, to a tribal thinking. Why? Because from Father Abraham comes Isaac and Jacob's name is changed to Israel. And we know that that's where the 12 sons or 12 tribes came from. So you're moving into a collective, which is what tribal's about, tribes of people. In fact, when you read the narrative, many times it speaks of the tribes of Israel. It's a tribal thing. And when Israel first started her movement out of bondage, was a movement that brought her into conflict with many other nations along the way. And so she entered, in her earlier days especially, into the warrior period because she was always at war. And because of the time in history when that was, and every other nation, not just Israel, everybody had a warrior consciousness in societies, it meant that Israel interpreted God through the lens of the warrior. And that meant that, well, God is on our side. God wants us to destroy the enemies. We hear the voice of God saying, go do this and go do that. And that corresponded to their way of seeing. Jesus, of course, as we get later on, Jesus is going to say, put down the sword. Jesus wasn't trying to contradict what happened in the past. He was trying to say, this is where we've grown in the present. So Jesus is saying, you've heard it said that, and he would point to something in the past. Then he'd turn around and say, but I say to you. And all Jesus is trying to do is to indicate there are things that were truth at that time. There are things that worked in the way God was interpreted, spirituality was interpreted. And Jesus is saying, but I say to you, and he's helping in that evolutionary pull because he always pointed toward God as the source, and that pull comes from spirituality itself. So we have this evolution. Moses is also, of course, associated with the law. When you think about the phrase Moses in the law, it's because he was in the story, however you interpret these stories, and that's a matter of personal faith. But as far as the narrative goes, the point of the story is that Moses is associated with the law and with commandments. Now, when those commandments are given, again, what happened as far as the collective Israel? It put Israel in a position of obedient, disobedient, righteous, unrighteous. They had laws that determined whether you were clean or unclean. You see, this was a paradigm of thinking that was happening because that's the way all nations were thinking in that period of history. You take the Apostle Peter, for example. When Peter grew up in Israel, it was wrong to eat certain kinds of food because they were considered from earlier centuries back to be unclean. But Peter had a dream where this whole net of food was set before him and he was told to go and eat. This dream state that Peter was in was basically a revelation that things had changed in terms of understanding, that no longer was the paradigm of clean, unclean, faithful, unfaithful, believing, unbelieving, the basis for identity. Now I say the basis for identity because it doesn't mean that I don't have faith or I don't have belief. But the way I look at faith and belief now is far different than the way I looked at faith and belief in my earlier days. Today I would say that my faith has nothing to do with my identity. And my belief is that my belief has nothing to do with my identity. Well, then what's the source of my identity, if not what I do or what I from self accomplish? The source of my identity is the same as every other human on the planet. It's God and God alone. And the question then becomes, how conscious or aware am I and every other person on the planet of the spiritual identity innate to everyone? Now it's a consciousness issue. So we know that the law comes, and the law is expanding Adam. Remember, Adam was given a commandment. Thou shalt not eat. In Israel, the collective, you move from Adam, the individual. In Israel, the collective, that's expanded. Now, for those of you that come from the theological side, you know that when Paul was writing, he said that when the law was added, when the law was given, sin increased. Now, as a fundamentalist, I would have sat there and said, what are you talking about? We need law to stop sin. We need commandments so that we quit this sinning. But what Paul realized was that when you give commandments and they expand, remember, a sin is a violation of a boundary. So the more commandments you have that are describing a form in which you're going to interpret as either good or evil, obedient, disobedient, the more people are going to miss the mark, and the more they're going to disagree that they missed the mark. And that's going to lead to an increase of sin as a way of seeing. Everyone then becomes a sinner. Or my viewpoints always seem to be good, and things I don't like indicate that someone else is evil. So that kind of thinking actually increases. And why does it increase? Well, the best way to understand what is not is to experience what is. Meaning that if I want to understand daytime, it's a lot easier to understand in terms of night, and vice versa. So all these things had to be increased from the standpoint that spiritual consciousness could then evolve. And so Paul will again use the analogy that this represented childhood for him. Remember, Paul grew up not only under the law, but Paul says, hey, I was someone that advanced far beyond other students my age when I studied at the feet of Rabbi Gamaliel under the law. Paul understood what it meant for commandments. But Paul also understood that the law and those commandments had their place in time. And when he saw the transform work of Jesus, he realized what God was doing, because God's the source. And that was that God was showing Paul that if you did not evolve beyond that commandment level, then Paul said, the law which is good became death to me. How does something good become death? Well, it became death because he realized he was using the commandments through self as source to show his righteousness. In other words, I, Paul, am obeying all the commandments. I, therefore, have established a righteousness identity. Later, he writes to the people over in Philippi, and he says, I see now through Jesus what I was doing. I get it. That's what we were supposed to do at the time. But now the next level of evolution Jesus is showing me is that actually what I was doing was having a righteousness of my own. And that's in Philippians, as he writes to those folks. So for Paul, he understood you move from childhood and you move on up, and this is an evolutionary process. Now, there are many other things that happen under Moses. We'll wrap up with two of these. One is that when they were traveling in the wilderness, there was a tabernacle. The tabernacle was a mobile thing. It moved with the children of Israel as they went through the wilderness. You had a holy place and you had a holy of holies and a curtain that separated the two. And once again, the presence of God was in the holy place, holy of holies. The other thing that came under Moses was the priesthood. Priesthoods are always associated with religion. And so with the priesthood, it was a male hierarchy, because at that time, everything in all cultures, for the most part, was male-dominated. And within that male hierarchy was the authority to explain to the people what was and what wasn't to be done. But even among that, you had a history within their priesthood of the fact that these were still people subject to positions of corruption, and that never changes through history. So you have a tabernacle, you have priesthood. See, all these things are foundational points of a religion. They all point to a form, and the way you do tabernacle, the way you do temple, the way you do church, the kind of priesthood you have. Who can be in the priesthood? Can a female be in the priesthood? Well, not in some religions. And on we go. And all these things, of course, denominate, which is to say divide, which is to say promote the concept of death in that sense. That may sound a little bit harsh, maybe it is, but we're trying to explain why we see this Spirit of God, nothing we're doing, but we see what God is doing in opening the eyes and helping us to evolve to a better place. So next time we'll pick up with a few more things from the Hebrew writings, which precede the teachings of Jesus and the apostolic writings. And specifically, we'll talk a little bit about David and a little bit about the prophets. But again, I really appreciate you hanging in there with me. And as you can see, we have an email address here, info@presence.tv. Please feel free to send me questions, comments, no matter pro, con, what you think. We have nothing to defend in that sense. We believe that you're in the same place we are in terms of spiritual identity. So now we're just trying to figure out deeper and greater depths to it. So please feel free to do that. I'll be doing some podcasts at a later time where I attempt to address some of those things. So I hope everybody out there has a great day today. And again, thanks for joining us.